What we are seeing around the cascading of university funding, those who are impact oriented are going to be more favourably received by government, read they will get more funding, than those who cannot demonstrate the impact of the research that they do.
Hello, and welcome to the Entrepreneurship podcast series by UIN. I am Valjana Razbaeva, Director of Research and Training at UIN, and I'm your host for today. In this episode, we dive into the future of doctoral education with Hélène de Burgh-Woodman, Vice-Chancellor for Research Training at the University of Western Australia. Drawing on her work on entrepreneurial doctorates and her contribution to our latest Future of Universities thought book, we explore why the traditional PhD model is under pressure, how universities can better prepare researchers for complex, real-world challenges, and what it takes to expand doctoral pathways without compromising rigor or the core principle of original knowledge. We're joined today by Hélène de Burgh-Woodman, who is the Vice-Chancellor for Research Training at the University of Western Australia, whose contribution to the entrepreneurial edition really challenges us to rethink one of the most established parts of the university system, doctoral education. And the starting point for today is a simple but quite provocative question. How can universities claim to be innovative and innovation-driven if their doctoral programs have remained largely unchanged for centuries? And more specifically, what would it mean to take the idea of an entrepreneurial PhD seriously? So Hélène, welcome and thanks for joining us. Maybe I'd like to start with the idea that a PhD could take very different shape and form, and where the core contribution might be a venture or an artifact.
Thanks so much. And I think that really goes to the heart of a lot of the kinds of conversations that we in the university sector are having more broadly about what is the remit, what is the purpose, and what is the contribution of the university as a social and economic institution inside our communities and economies. And obviously for me, the doctoral context is the one that I concentrate most thoughtfully on, given my role and the way in which we think about future workforces, future competences coming into economies inevitably invokes these kinds of questions when we think about the doctoral context. So I think it's a really timely query, and I'm happy to kind of advance some views, but I'm also mindful that others would potentially have quite different ones. I suppose I would start out by saying that fundamentally the point of a PhD, as opposed to any other kind of training that one might get, whether it be inside the university system or beyond, is this idea of the significant contribution to knowledge. And that's really the unassailable principle that has to remain intact when we are looking at the possibilities for doctoral education and what we want that degree to yield in terms of the kind of people that we release out into the world, whether it be through the academic context or industry, government, social contexts as well. And of course, we are seeing an increase in people, indeed the majority of people across the West, using their PhD not to enter into academia, but actually to become top-tier deep experts in their relative industries or fields. So there's an interesting shift going on there that I think universities are slowly becoming more cognizant of. But I think also broadly, and perhaps this is connected to why people would potentially do PhD now as a distinct degree, is the reality is that we are working in a global context of very wicked problems. I think we're all keenly aware of that this week in particular, and that increasingly universities are being challenged to shape their remit to address and respond to those wicked problems. If we think about the traditional role of universities, yes, they were purveyors of fundamental research, they were purveyors of education for those who came to them. But increasingly, we are seeing government imperative look to universities as problem solvers and indeed wicked problem interrogators, as well as just researchers and educators in the classical sense. So I think there's a little bit of external impetus coming for why universities would be thinking what the purpose of a PhD is in the context of this broader external environment and what a PhD can do and bring to society and economy in the face of those wicked problems. The other thing that I would say to that, though, is In the same way that we have looked to who comes into university over time, and we have seen a lot of demographic shift, particularly in the undergraduate context, around who is able to come to university to conduct their education. Similarly, in the PhD context, the reality is that if we are going to produce wicked problem solvers and problem interrogators, we need different kinds of people coming into our research ecosystems. And if we just keep the same models, we attract the same people, and ultimately the degree diminishes and we lose major workforce capability. So I think we want to be able to respond to need. The model itself needs to be able to respond to need, and equally, we need to be able to attract different kinds of people that can help us do that. And so, different models, such as the entrepreneurial PhD or industry facing PhDs, whatever they may be, necessarily invite different kinds of people to come into the university community and contribute.
Thank you, Helen. I think that certainly helps to set the stage and provide the context a little bit. And I want to pick on what feels like a really a fundamental shift here. So what does it mean in practice, would you say, to rethink in this context the original contribution to knowledge? If that contribution, for example, is a startup or a prototype or a creative artifact or a solution to that wicked problem, how do we think about rigor in that context?
I'm always mindful of the fact that we need to tease out some of these words. We use terms such as entrepreneurial and practice-based models somewhat interchangeably. The fact is that they do refer to different things and potentially invite different kinds of people into the canon. So for me, an entrepreneurial endeavor is quite different from practice-based to the extent that entrepreneurial by its very definition is blue sky. It's a step into the unknown, a lot like classic research, whereas practice-based models typically respond to a predefined area of complexity or a problem that is foreknown by a certain industry or a certain discipline, and then contributions to that knowledge base are made accordingly, both of which are entirely valid, and we need both capabilities, but they are quite different endeavors and yield quite different outcomes for what we look to or value in the context of what a contribution to knowledge would be. As I say, I have a high level of comfort with both, and I think there is increasingly an appropriately rich diversity of knowledge types that land in different contexts, and the ability to be able to make those different contributions falls within the remit of universities and university-based research. Your query about how do we think about or preserve rigor. To me, certainly in the academic context, when we use this term rigor, it's also a backhanded way of really asking a very profound question of whether the research is true. Can we replicate it and get the same result? Does it make sense in the context of current, tested, known knowledge? So when we talk about rigor, we're really talking about a fundamental commitment to trying to describe, capture, and make visible some reality that we can rely on for future endeavour as we move forward. That's always been the point of what we are trying to express when we ask, is research rigorous? The problem that we confront now is that that's not quite the era that we are in anymore. And over recent years, we have seen this kind of very fundamental repositioning and re-questioning of what have traditionally been very safe terms, such as the truth, a knowable reality, rigor in that context. What we're seeing in the research environment, or what we would regard as the classic research environment, is the fact that retractions are up. Increasingly, AI, I will say, accompanies or strays out into actually doing the work for academics, such that it becomes a little bit more difficult to know who has done what and where the contributions lie. Increasingly, we are seeing concerns around what is called data slop. That is to say, is the data itself reliable such that we can be satisfied that rigor has actually been demonstrated? And so increasingly, this is going to make the case for academic research as the only owners of demonstrable rigor a little bit problematic. So if we want to go back to the idea of rigor as a shorthand for asking, is this true? Is this reliable? Does it hold up against an existing canon of knowledge that we know to be reliable? I would suggest that how better to test that in terms of real demonstrable artifact-based outcomes in things that we can test and know and interrogate and decide whether they actually yield the innovation that they promise or not. That said, though, I'm an academic, so I certainly, while I advocate for new and novel forms of knowledge contribution packaged in different ways, I would also very quickly hasten to add that I do think that one of the most important aspects of the classic research canon is that frontier dimension of fundamental research. And we can't fully lose that. And we need to continue to valorize that. If as human beings we stop imagining or speculating and experimenting without quite the ability yet to say it's true, but it could be, then we really lose a fundamental human quality of curiosity and discovery. In one sense, the pessimist, if you like, in me says that I feel we've lost a little bit of that frontier endeavor in academic pursuit in a context of the publish and perish culture, the celebration of the H-index as some kind of indication of supremacy, and the loss of the deep thinking culture that has yielded so much of the knowledge capital that we've developed over centuries. And the fact is, increasingly research is showing us that we live in a bit of an intention deficit culture. And I think this risks diminishing the intergenerational conveying of reliable knowledge, deep knowledge, frontier knowledge. And one of the key things that universities as owners of that knowledge can do is ensure that knowledge resilience and intergenerational knowledge transfer continues to occur. But that's not to say that it all has to look one way. So I think there are some balancing acts in there for how we think about what knowledge is, how we demonstrate its value, and the different ways in which we capture it. And by necessity, it has to be a rich mosaic.
The UIIN Conference 2026, where universities, industry, and innovators meet to shape the future. Join us in Stockholm for 3 days of insight, inspiration, and impact. Hear from global thought leaders, expand your network, and be part of the conversations driving collaboration forward. Secure your place now at uiin.org/conference.
Rich mosaic, and also it sounds to me like a very interesting balancing act of how we dance around some of those forms and also make sure that the contribution is made, but also that we still educate and train the researchers in the way that they can make that contribution back to society in a rigorous but also innovative way. Which brings me to the next question, and I think this is where I would like to perhaps dig a little bit deeper and ask you to unpack a bit what entrepreneurial PhD could look like in practice. For example, could you walk us through how an entrepreneurial PhD works and what is perhaps a different from day one for a candidate? And maybe you can also tell us a little bit about the structure, the supervision, the mindset behind it. So I'm really curious to hear how this could look like really in practice.
So I suppose the obvious example for me to draw upon is what we put in place at the University of Technology, Sydney, in Sydney, Australia. I think probably institutional context is one of the key components that needs to be right in order for these kinds of models to potentially fly. So I would say of UTS that UTS is an exceptional university, draws a particularly diverse academic cohort with an incredibly broad and rich skill set, everything from very foundational right through to highly applied, highly industry embedded research. So you, by definition, have an academic community that has a tremendous diversity and a tremendous depth of expertise in the first instance. And it's an institution that prides itself on being innovative, enterprising. It is located within Tech Central, which is a whole kind of technology and entrepreneurship hub in the centre of Sydney. And so its context is right for having these kinds of conversations and pursuing these kinds of opportunities in the first instance. You've got the right cohort of academics, you've got the right external environment, you've got government support, and you've got the right institutional identity to understand the value of these kinds of differentiating opportunities. In terms of the project itself, it was never a program that was intended to replace other forms of doctoral model, and the university offers several different PhD models. And it was always intended to attract a certain kind of entrepreneur. It's a university of technology. We were always going for deep tech, med tech, ad tech, those energy transition technologies. So it was always going to be a focus on those sorts of projects or artifacts that might come forward, which means that selection is key. Who you are bringing into the program and the institution in the first instance becomes really important. It's not for everyone, and the element of originality really needs to be clear from the start. So it's not a testing ground for someone who's trying to build out an online retail store. It is a serious context for deep developmental work to occur so that entire industries can have the benefit of real breakthrough innovation, transformative intellect coming into their ecosystem. So it's really important to understand that who you're bringing in the first instance is right. The kinds of projects that are selected have that breakthrough possibility associated with them. And that, going back to our consideration of what we mean by rigor, I think that was one of the things that was put in place very early on, precisely to protect the kind of rigor and to have confidence in the fact that an original contribution to knowledge that would have potential breakthrough opportunity for industries had to be front and center in terms of how we set up the criteria in the first instance. The program itself, candidates are given entrepreneurial training, the machinations of how to operate as an entrepreneur, with work in intellectual property and understanding the implications of managing intellectual property, funding and funder systems and contexts and behaviours so that they are able to participate in that funder environment, understanding the industry ecosystem in which their opportunity or artifact operates, basic management skills, because obviously to be an entrepreneur is to be a business owner as well. And so we scaffolded out the program with those auxiliary skills as well. In terms of the project, it's run with a supervision panel, as any PhD candidate would do, but the artifact that goes forward is the tech or the object that they develop, and that's accompanied by an exegesis that positions it in the field, positions it in the industry, and enables the examiners to understand why this is such a significant contribution to knowledge. So there still has to be that show cause for why this is important work. This also means that you need to be quite thoughtful about who should be examining it, because it is not a classic thesis. And so calling upon those with more of an applied orientation, or pracademics as they are sometimes known, or those who can appreciate the innovation on its own terms, are all kind of key components to making a program like this work. So they were some of the key considerations that we worked through as this program came online. The one thing that I would say too, and perhaps this goes back to institutional mission in the 21st century, if this is done well as a program, the institutional benefit is the commercialization pipeline. And this can be a really powerful way to catalyze commercialization and tech transfer, because you're actually inviting commercializable ideas into the fold from the get-go, and then you are co-cultivating them in a partnership. So if the entrepreneur understands that relationship correctly, and they understand that the university can be a really benevolent but also supportive partner, and that the relationship can continue even after the PhD has concluded, then that can also be a really powerful engine room for the university as well.
Which circles back, I think, to what you said about the importance of the right institutional context. So having this commercial, I guess, orientation or just entrepreneurial hat from the get-go can help perhaps also accelerate some of those developments. And I really appreciated what you said about how the PhDs basically are going through that process. But I would like to also maybe explore a bit more how the supervision and the academic roles are unfolding in this context. So you already mentioned the pracademics, so that I think already helps a lot to set that context. But I am also wondering, how does the role of the supervisor change just generally in this entrepreneurial PhD? And do you think that academics in this context also need different capabilities to support these models. So how mindful and how intentional one should be when setting out those kinds of programs in terms of that right setting that you were talking about. Do we really first have to also train, I would say, a cohort of those academics who can then support those PhD students along the way?
Yes, yes, and yes. What I would say, I suppose I go back to my earlier comment about the nature of the university that this was done at in the first instance. It's an institution that is blessed with a diverse academic workforce who have different strengths in different domains. Engineering is one of its key strengths as a university. By default, they are engineers who are engaged in industry projects. They look to the outward material outcomes of their own research. And so it's only a slight shuffle to the left for academics who are already leaning towards that orientation to be taking on projects like this. And indeed, commercialization opportunities, tech transfer opportunities, etc., are part of the lifeblood of UTS as an institution and other institutions around the world. So institutions like that with those kinds of profiles are pretty well calibrated to start interrogating what do we really want to deliver out of our PhD programs, and could we look at different opportunities for different outcomes. That makes the ability to stand up programs like this much more straightforward because you have existing capability. Bearing in mind too that not everyone in your institution has to be able to do this. It is horses for courses, and that you lean on different talents and different abilities for different parts of university business. And this is one part of university business, and therefore, as long as you have enough confidence in it, you allow those academics who have that orientation to fly. And then there will be other academics who deliver different kinds of value in different ways as well. I think for more what I would call traditional institutions, this is a more difficult transition. I think it's one that over time, if adaptation does not start to occur, will be somewhat taken out of their hands. I mean, what we are seeing in certain Western government settings at the moment around the cascading of university funding, those who are impact oriented are going to be more favourably received by government, read they will get more funding, than those who cannot demonstrate the impact of the research that they do. So I think over time you will see a corralling effect of institutions such that they will have to engage meaningfully with the innovation, entrepreneurship, and impact endeavour. Again, not the entire institution, but they will need to get on board if they have not already done so, if for no other reason than survivability. That presents an opportunity to think about your workforce configuration. Do we have the right blend of people inside our organisation? That's a planning exercise that can take a little bit of time. And equally looking to our existing capability, where can we potentially uplift, upskill? And I think that goes to your point about, do you need to do training? Do you need to cultivate an awareness of this kind of opportunity? Yes, you do. If you do not have that embedded in your ecosystem already, there's an opportunity to do so.
All of that makes me think about the notion of providing diversity of career pathways for researchers more generally, that what you said about coexisting of different models within the system perhaps makes it possible to then develop some of those models in parallel while we talk about practical or industrial PhD, entrepreneurial PhD, more traditional PhD models. But when we talk about those universities who would perhaps like to go into that sort of transformation, where do you think they should look first? Do they first need to understand what kind of culture they have or what kind of scaffolding they have available? I'm just sort of trying to think of those who perhaps are now wondering what would be the first step for them in that direction. What would be your advice as somebody who've been at the forefront of that development at the institution?
I think there are probably two questions. What are we wanting to achieve, and what have we got already in terms of existing capability? Chances are pretty much every institution has got some kernel that they can capitalize on and grow out and use that as the basis for a contagion effect. So if you're clear on what you are wanting to achieve and why you are wanting to do this, and what success looks like for you as an institution. That then enables you to backtrack on, okay, what existing capability have we got? And basically do a readiness scan on your internal resources around who's there, who could be there with a bit of a push, who do we need to kind of leave be to do other kinds of work. And so I think that internal horizon scanning around who you've actually got inside your existing ecosystem is a really important thing, not just in terms of here and now capability, but who could also be cultivated. So once you've set your objectives, then you can do your internal work. Then from there, think more progressively about your recruitment practices, who you are bringing into the institution moving forward, whether that be in terms of formal recruitment of internal faculty who are going to go on to become permanent staff, but also in terms of your broader context around adjuncts. Who have you got in your alumni world? Who have you got in your kind of emeritus world? Who can help you build competence and capability in these spaces without having to make major investment, because as we know, universities are typically resource constrained, and going out and getting 100 new industry professors is not really a viable strategy in the near term. So who have you got in your world that can give you that lift?
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm just being mindful of time, so perhaps I could go to like a closing remark. So perhaps one thing that I would like you to do is to imagine if you were design a PhD today from scratch with no legacy constraints, with no contextual constraints, what would you like to keep and what would you let go of? Because I think that will certainly help us to paint a picture of how you think the contribution can be best made in the most impactful way.
Like many conversations, we conclude where we start. And I suppose the one holy grail for me, the one unassailable, the one bit that I am not prepared to entertain any compromise on is that original contribution to knowledge. After that, it's pretty much fair game for me. You know, I spend time thinking about what would happen if you sort of like genetically coded PhD information and then had it as an iterative process where people wrote into the code over time. I go to all sorts of strange places about how you can work with, quantify, and capture knowledge and have that as an iterative process between humans. And so in my mind, I go to some fairly odd places. But I think for me, at a minimum, I would always encourage those of us who signed up to a career of endeavour and to discovery and to curiosity to always go back to those fundamental guiding lights as to why you became an academic in the first place, and challenge ourselves to say, what is the art of the possible? Because my sense of it is that sometimes we get quite caught up in our existing structures and processes. The way it is because it's the way it was, and therefore it will have to be the way it will always have to be. We're not in that space. And as clever people, nor should academics be in that space.
Hélène, thank you so much. It's been wonderful. And this has been a really thought-provoking, but I also thought very practical conversation. So thank you, and to everyone for joining us today. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's discussion. Follow UIN on LinkedIn, and if you are enjoying our podcast, make sure to subscribe, rate, and review in your podcast platform of choice to help other people find this content too.